Welcome, history buffs and lovers of the unexpected. Forget the tales of damsels in distress and knights in shining armor. Tonight we're diving deep into the opulent, scandalous, and often bizarre lives of medieval queens who didn't just wear the crown, they redefined what it meant to rule. These weren't your typical picture-perfect monarchs knitting tapestries and gracefully accepting their husbands' infidelities. Oh no, these women were forces of nature, wielding power, passion, and sometimes a suspiciously convenient trapdoor or a well-placed dagger. Before we plunge into the juicy details, take a moment to show some love by hitting that like button and subscribing if you're ready to have your perception of medieval royalty completely ready. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you joining us from? It's always incredible to see our global community of history enthusiasts. Now settle in, perhaps with a glass of wine or something stronger. You might need it, as we embark on a journey through the chaotic bedchambers and politically charged courts of some of history's most unconventional queens. Joanna of Naples. Love, loss, and a legend of lethal liaisons. Our first royal rebel is Joanna I of Naples, who ascended to the throne in 1343 and seemingly decided that the rulebook was more of a suggestion box. In an era where queens were expected to be demure and dutiful, Joanna embraced her sovereignty with a boldness that bordered on audacious. Where others saw rigid tradition, Joanna saw a playground of opportunity, particularly when it came to matters of the heart, or perhaps more accurately, the bedchamber. Marriage for medieval nobility was often a strategic alliance, a way to secure power and produce heirs. Joanna, however, seemed to approach it with a rather experimental spirit. She married 4 times, a number that raised eyebrows even in a period where royal remarriage wasn't unheard of. But it wasn't just the quantity, it was the alarming speed with which her husbands seemed to meet their ends that fueled the whispers and solidified her scandalous reputation. Her first husband, Andrew of Hungary, barely lasted a year after their coronation. His untimely demise, found hanging from a window, was officially ruled an accident. But the court buzzed with rumors, and the lack of any real investigation only amplified the suspicions surrounding the young queen. Joanna, publicly, remained composed, but the questions lingered like a persistent shadow. But it's a particularly lurid legend that truly cemented Joanna's place in the annals of scandalous queens. The tale goes that she had a secret trapdoor installed beneath her royal bed. Imagine the scene. A night of supposed royal intimacy, followed by a sudden plunge into the castle moat for an unsuspecting partner who had perhaps outstayed his welcome or fallen out of favor. Efficient? Absolutely. Regardless of the truth behind the trapdoor, the story resonated because it seemed to fit the persona Joanna projected. A queen who ruled with both elegance and a certain theatrical flair. She wasn't simply reckless, she was selective, curating her relationships and alliances with a discerning eye. Some found her charming and magnetic, while others whispered about her dangerous allure, often while strategically positioning themselves near the nearest exit. Eleanor of Aquitaine, a queen of 2 kingdoms and a rebel heart. Joanna navigated a turbulent reign marked by wars, papal condemnation, and relentless political rivals, all while managing to generate enough bedroom gossip to fuel countless medieval ballads and cautionary tales. She wore her crown and her scandalous reputation with an unapologetic defiance, facing down threats from the sun-drenched shores of Naples. We journey to the 12th century and encounter a woman who didn't just live through history, she shaped it. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of France, then Queen of England, and the mother of not 1, but 2 future English kings. Eleanor didn't just play the Game of Thrones, she seemed to rewrite the rules as she went along, often with a wry smile and a strategically raised eyebrow. At the tender age of 15, Eleanor married Louis VI of France. Now Louis was a deeply pious man, rather socially awkward, and seemed to exude the energy of someone who married their cousin because they genuinely lacked other social pursuits. Eleanor, on the other hand, was witty, fiercely intelligent, possessed a formidable inheritance, and had the attention span of a caffeinated hummingbird. Their marriage, as you might imagine, was about as harmonious as a heavy metal concert in a monastery. Louis, in a misguided attempt at marital bonding, dragged Eleanor along on the Second Crusade to the Holy Land. For Louis, it was a deeply spiritual journey. For Eleanor, it was likely less of a pilgrimage and more of an extended, dusty vacation, with a soundtrack of her husband weeping at religious relics. She brought with her a dazzling wardrobe, a troupe of musicians, and perhaps a burgeoning affection for her handsome uncle, the Prince of Antioch. Rumors, as they often do in royal circles, began to swirl like desert sand in a sirocco wind. Louis predictably frowned. A lot. The marriage, already fragile, finally dissolved over a rather chilly supper in Damascus, the annulment granted with a palpable sense of relief on both sides. Eleanor, free from the constraints of her French marriage, practically sprinted back to her native Aquitaine and promptly remarried. Her new husband? Henry Plantagenet, the future King Henry II of England. He was 11 years her junior, possessed fiery red hair and a famously unpredictable temperament. In short, he was precisely her type. Their union produced 10 children, a seemingly endless series of political clashes, and what must have been one of the most intensely passive-aggressive royal households in European history. But Eleanor was far more than just a producer of future monarchs. Her court in Poitiers became a vibrant center of culture and intellectual life. She championed the concept of courtly love, a romantic ideal that encouraged noble ladies to be adored from afar by lovesick knights with impressive lineage and even more impressive emotional baggage. Of course, the "from afar" part was often liberally interpreted, leading to stolen glances, whispered sonnets, and clandestine rendezvous behind strategically placed tapestries. Eleanor's court became the ultimate destination for nobles with more passion than restraint. When Henry's eye began to wander, tiring of monogamy and perhaps Eleanor's sharp wit, she responded not with tears and recriminations, but with the strategic brilliance of a seasoned political operator. She actively supported her sons in their rebellion against their father. Henry, needless to say, was not amused. His response? 16 years of castle arrest for Eleanor. But for a woman of her intellect and spirit, imprisonment simply meant more time for strategic letter writing, the quiet enjoyment of fine wine, and the meticulous plotting of future vengeance through her formidable offspring. Eleanor of Aquitaine, a true royal rebel, defied expectations at every turn, leaving an indelible mark on the history of both France and England. Margaret of Burgundy, a pillowcase scandal that rocked a kingdom. Our next tale takes us to France in the early 14th century and introduces us to Margaret of Burgundy, a queen who, on paper, seemed destined for a life of quiet royal conformity. She possessed the requisite noble bloodline, was properly married to the heir to the French throne, the future Louis X, looked suitably regal in her ermine-trimmed gowns, and hadn't yet been implicated in any blatant poisoning plots at court banquets. A model medieval wife, at least superficially. However, the year 1314 brought a rather startling revelation to the French court. Keeping 3 bored and unsupervised princesses cooped up in a castle was less a recipe for serene domesticity and more a breeding ground for gossip, elaborate embroidery projects, and, as it turned out, illicit extramarital affairs. Margaret's marriage to Louis was, to put it mildly, dull. His charisma was often compared to that of boiled cabbage, and their marital life lacked any discernible spark. Margaret, it seems, grew weary of pretending that Louis's bedtime stories about tax reform were the height of seductive storytelling. Enter the Tour de Nesle affair. A scandal with a name so dramatic, it sounds like a medieval soap opera, penned by someone with a penchant for intrigue and luxurious linens. According to the historical accounts, Margaret and her sister-in-law, Blanche of Burgundy, began engaging in secret meetings with 2 rather handsome Norman knights. Their chosen rendezvous point? The Tour de Nesle, a royal tower conveniently located by the Seine River, offering both privacy and a slightly ominous, perhaps even romantic, ambiance. Apparently, it was also soundproof enough to contain both courtly whispers and decidedly uncourtly behavior. The downfall of this clandestine quartet is one of the most bizarre and almost comical in royal history. The knights were eventually identified, not through elaborate espionage or whispered confessions, but because of pillowcases. Yes, you read that right. Royal servants noticed that these two particular knights possessed luxury linens identical to those used in the princess's private chambers. It seems that even in the 14th century, a queen's indiscretions could be undone by poor laundry choices. King Philip IV, Margaret's father-in-law and the reigning monarch, was, understandably, less than amused by this revelation. The unfortunate knights were subjected to public torture and execution, a display designed to underscore the severity of their transgression. As for Margaret, she was imprisoned in Château Gaillard, a fortress about as cheerful as its name suggests. She died there 2 years later, the exact cause of her death remaining shrouded in the mists of medieval uncertainty. Illness, suffocation, or perhaps a husband eager for a clean slate as he ascended the throne. Margaret's crime wasn't treason, witchcraft, or political rebellion. It was, essentially, being a little too charmed, in the wrong tower, with the wrong men, and on the wrong set of pillowcases. In the rigid social hierarchy of medieval France, that was apparently enough to have you not just imprisoned, but virtually erased from the historical narrative. The Tour de Nesle affair serves as a potent reminder that even the most powerful individuals were subject to the strict moral codes of their time, and sometimes, the most scandalous downfalls can hinge on the most unexpected and mundane of details. Isabella of France, the she-wolf who invaded England. Our next queen, Isabella of France, seemingly had it all. Royal lineage, a glittering crown, and an enviable collection of French footwear. What she didn't have was a husband she could stand. Married to Edward II of England in 1308, Isabella found herself in a complicated marital situation from the start. Edward, while tall and handsome, seemed to reserve his emotional availability for his male favorites, a dynamic that didn't exactly foster marital bliss in a royal setting where producing heirs was paramount. Isabella faced immediate competition for Edward's affections in the form of Piers Gaveston, a charming knight with a flair for fashion and the political acumen of a startled badger. Edward lavished Gaveston with titles, lands, and the kind of attention most wives could only dream of receiving after years of dutiful service. At their coronation banquet, Gaveston reportedly outshone Isabella in the jewel department. She noticed. Gaveston's career trajectory was a roller coaster of exiles and recalls, eventually culminating in his beheading by a group of deeply unimpressed nobles who had grown tired of his arrogance and possibly his questionable taste in eyeliner. Isabella might have feigned a tear or two, but it's unlikely she was heartbroken. But the marital drama was far from over. Edward soon replaced Gaveston with Hugh Despenser the Younger, a man so avaricious and universally disliked that he made Gaveston look like a beloved national treasure. Despenser didn't just occupy the king's inner circle. He infiltrated the treasury, the council, and seemingly every noble's worst nightmares. He systematically undermined Isabella's allies, seized her lands, and even subjected her to public insults. A bold strategy, insulting the queen. Historically, it rarely ends well. By 1326, Isabella had reached her breaking point. Under the guise of diplomatic negotiations, she fled to France with her young son, the future Edward III. It was there that she encountered Roger Mortimer, a nobleman with a rebellious spirit, a strong jawline, and a conveniently unattached marital status. Together, Isabella and Mortimer hatched a plan of truly epic proportions, a full-scale invasion of England. Yes, you read that correctly. A queen, with her lover and teenage son in tow, launched a military campaign to reclaim her position and overthrow her husband. Incredibly, it worked. Edward II was captured and subsequently deposed. Then came the inevitable rumors surrounding his death in prison. While the particularly gruesome tale involving a red-hot poker is largely considered an exaggeration by modern historians, the circumstances surrounding Edward's demise remained suspiciously murky. Isabella, while not directly implicated in the more violent accounts, certainly had motive and opportunity. For several years, Isabella ruled England as regent for her young son, sharing power, and likely more, with Mortimer. Their joint rule, however, proved unpopular, and eventually, her own son, Edward III, grew weary of their control and orchestrated their downfall. Isabella was placed in comfortable confinement for the remainder of her life. From a neglected wife, she transformed into a rebel queen who dared to invade her own kingdom, leaving behind a legacy as the she-wolf of France, a formidable figure who defied the conventions of medieval queenship and seized power with audacious determination. Agnes of Navarre, whispers, wine, and vanishing courtiers. Our next queen, Agnes of Navarre, was born into a world of intricate political maneuvering, poetic traditions, and dynasties where a carefully cultivated romantic entanglement could either solidify an alliance or trigger a full-blown war. As the daughter of a king and the sister of a queen with her own share of scandal, Agnes was raised with a keen understanding of the power of both words and whispered secrets. She became Queen of Aragon through her marriage to James II's grandson, a seemingly advantageous match. However, her new husband, James IV, turned out to be eccentric. And by eccentric, I mean the kind of king who might wake up in the middle of the night convinced that the curtains were plotting treason against him. Agnes, finding herself married to a man whose grip on reality seemed tenuous at best, responded in a way that many resourceful medieval noblewomen with limited options did. She sought affection elsewhere, quietly, discreetly, and with an apparent appreciation for variety. Agnes allegedly engaged in a series of affairs. Her rumored lovers spanned the social spectrum, including knights, courtiers, musicians, and even, according to some particularly spicy gossip, a monk who seemed to have a rather flexible interpretation of his vows. Agnes was known for her charm, her refined cultural tastes, and her fluency in the art of flirtation, a skill that likely proved far more useful in the Aragonese court than a mastery of Latin. In the close confines of a medieval castle, however, secrets rarely stay buried for long. Whispers began to circulate, and soon, Agnes's romantic entanglements became the subject of more fervent discussion than religious texts. It's important to note that Agnes was never officially caught in any compromising situations. There were no public trials, no dramatic confessions extracted under duress. Yet, a curious pattern of untimely deaths began to emerge around her. A rival here, a gossipy maid there, and one unfortunate courtier who inexplicably seemed to have tripped and fallen into a very deep moat. Was Agnes orchestrating these convenient disappearances? History offers no definitive answer, but the palace kitchen staff reportedly developed a habit of locking the spice cabinets whenever she was nearby, just in case. Eventually, her husband passed away, surprisingly not by poisoning. Agnes, rather than seeking another husband, retired to a convent. Not out of remorse, mind you, but more as a matter of tradition. Convents served as a sort of gilded retirement home for noblewomen, places where they could read, pray, and quietly outlive their scandals away from the prying eyes of the court. Agnes never remarried, perhaps because potential suitors were wary, or perhaps because she finally found a measure of peace among nuns who were less inclined to ask nosy questions. Agnes of Navarre left behind no heirs, but her legacy lived on in the hushed whispers of the court, the lingering rumors in the castle corridors, and a cautionary undertone in every love poem that ended abruptly and mysteriously. Joanna of Castile, a love so strong it blurred the lines of sanity. Our next queen, Joanna of Castile, was born a princess, inherited a queendom, and became a tragic figure whose intense devotion to her husband ultimately led to her isolation and the enduring label of Joanna the Mad. Her marriage to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy seemed, initially, like a fairy tale union. And no, the Handsome wasn't just a courtesy title. Philip was genuinely considered the medieval equivalent of a heartthrob, with flowing blonde hair, impressive physique, and a charming smirk that suggested he had never once considered doing household chores. Joanna, despite her royal upbringing and political training, fell for Philip with a passionate intensity. Theirs was, by all accounts, a deeply physical and initially loving relationship. Until it wasn't. Philip, it turned out, was not only handsome and ambitious, but also remarkably allergic to the concept of marital fidelity. His infidelities started subtly, but soon escalated to a point of brazenness usually reserved for poorly written romance novels. Joanna, a woman of strong emotions, did not take betrayal lightly. Her responses ranged from fits of rage and tearful interrogations to, according to some rather colorful accounts, attempts at physically confronting her husband's mistresses. But the story takes a truly bizarre and heartbreaking turn with Philip's sudden death in 1506. The official cause? Allegedly, drinking cold water after a vigorous game of ball. Even for the 16th century, this explanation raised eyebrows and seemed suspiciously vague. Joanna's grief was profound, but not in the conventional sense. She didn't simply don the traditional black veil and retreat into mourning. Instead, she had Philip's body exhumed and insisted on carrying the coffin with her for months. Joanna reportedly ordered the coffin opened repeatedly, ostensibly to ensure that her beloved Philip hadn't been stolen away. She kissed his decaying lips and refused to allow any other women near the corpse, as if even in death, Philip remained a flight risk in the realm of romance. Joanna's mournful procession across Castile with Philip's coffin became a spectacle, a macabre journey with stops at monasteries where she insisted on sleeping next to his remains. Rumors even circulated, though chroniclers became understandably vague on this point, about the nature of her nocturnal vigils. Whispers turned to concerned murmurs, and couriers likely developed ulcers from the sheer awkwardness of their duties. Eventually, Joanna's father, Ferdinand II of Aragon, declared her insane and had her confined to a convent in Tordesillas, where she remained for the next 46 years, a record of extended royal confinement, even among history's most emotionally complex queens. Was Joanna truly mad? Or was she simply a deeply grief-stricken woman, unable to let go of the man who had both captivated and betrayed her? Historians continue to debate the nuances of her mental state. Regardless, Joanna of Castile remains a poignant example of a queen whose legacy is more defined by her intense posthumous devotion than by her actions during her reign. Her story serves as a cautionary tale about the destructive power of all-consuming love and the fine line between profound grief and perceived madness in the eyes of those who hold power. Catherine the Great, debunking the equestrian myth and embracing real scandals. Before we continue our journey through the medieval period, let's take a brief yet essential detour into the 18th century to address a particularly persistent and outlandish rumor. No, Catherine the Great, the formidable Empress of Russia, did not die while engaging in an intimate act with a horse. The fact that this preposterous claim even exists speaks volumes about the power of smear campaigns and the enduring human fascination with the salacious and the bizarre, especially when it involves powerful women. While technically outside our medieval time frame, Catherine earns her place in this discussion solely based on the sheer density of scandal that clung to her name. Born a minor German princess, she married into the Russian Romanov dynasty and quickly realized that her husband, Peter III, was less a capable czar and more of an overgrown child with a penchant for military toys and an unsettling admiration for Prussia. Peter preferred playing soldier to governing an empire, or frankly, spending any meaningful time with his wife. Catherine, a woman of considerable ambition and intellect trapped in a frigid marriage, naturally looked elsewhere for companionship and intellectual stimulation. She cultivated relationships with a series of lovers, officers, nobles, poets, perhaps even a furniture maker, depending on which historical accounts you favor. Some were young, some were remarkably competent, and one was reportedly 18 when Catherine was 60, a detail that, rather than being scandalous, is arguably more inspiring in its audacity. But Catherine was no mere hedonist. She was a shrewd political operator. Her lovers were often rewarded handsomely with estates, titles, and influence, creating a sort of informal royal loyalty program. Impress the empress, and you might find yourself elevated. Fail to impress, and well, there was always the possibility of a lengthy stay in Siberia. Now, back to that infamous rumor. Sometime after her death, Catherine's political enemies, or perhaps just some very bored aristocrats, concocted the wildly improbable tale of her demise involving a horse. The rumor is so anatomically and practically absurd that it should have died an immediate death. It didn't. Why? Because Catherine was a powerful woman who ruled decisively, without the guidance of a male consort. She implemented significant reforms, crushed rebellions, and wasn't afraid to tell the church to stay out of state affairs. In a patriarchal society, the only way some could process her unprecedented power was to invent a lurid and demeaning story that reduced her to a figure of ridicule. In reality, Catherine the Great died in bed from a stroke, fully clothed and with no equine companions present. But the damage to her reputation was done. The myth persisted because sensationalism often trumps truth, and Catherine, already a figure of considerable intrigue during her lifetime, became a legend, albeit a distorted one, in death. While she may not have engaged in amorous pursuits with livestock, she certainly rode the tide of history with a commanding presence. Catherine's story serves as a stark reminder of how gender bias and political animosity can shape and distort historical narratives, particularly those of powerful women. Fredegund of Nustria, the queen with a knife under her pillow. If you thought medieval queens were all delicate embroidery and whispered sighs by candlelight, allow me to introduce you to Fredagund of Nustria. This was a woman who held firm beliefs in the sanctity of marital duty, the importance of royal dignity, and the effectiveness of a well-aimed stab in the neck. Born a servant, Fredegund ascended the ranks of the Frankish court with an efficiency that typically requires either extraordinary charisma or a rather significant body count. In Fredegund's case, it seems she possessed a healthy dose of both. She caught the eye of King Chilperic I of Nustria, a Frankish ruler who already had a wife. But not for long. His first queen mysteriously died shortly after Fredegund's arrival on the scene. A shocking coincidence, to be sure. The second wife, Galswintha, met an even more definitive end, found strangled in her bed not long after marrying Chilperic. Fredegund, by this point firmly ensconced in the king's favor, vehemently denied any involvement, likely with the classic, "I may be holding a pillow, but that doesn't prove anything" tone. Once married to Chilperic herself, Fredegund didn't exactly mellow out. In fact, her reign was marked by a distinct escalation of ruthless behavior. She was notorious for keeping a knife tucked under her pillow, not figuratively but literally. This was a queen who approached bedtime with the preparedness of someone entering a potential crime scene. Political rivals were poisoned, bishops who dared to criticize her vanished without a trace, and overly gossipy servants often met with unfortunate accidents. Her long-standing feud with Brunhilde of Austrasia, her sister-in-law, became the stuff of legend. A decades-long royal grudge match fought with assassinations and relentless political maneuvering. Fredegund once dispatched a hired assassin to murder Brunhilde's son during a church mass. Subtlety was clearly not her forte. Even after her husband's own rather suspicious assassination, Fredegund continued to rule as regent for her young son, Clothar II. She navigated complex diplomatic situations, crushed rebellions with an iron fist, and likely added a few more names to her ever-growing list of adversaries. She wasn't just feared, she was respected, primarily out of sheer terror. And yet, in a twist that feels almost like a clerical error in the grand narrative of her life, Fredegund reportedly died peacefully in her bed. Fredegund wasn't just a queen who might have slept with a knife. She was the knife, sharp, cold, and always ready to strike. She makes many of the other queens on this list seem like they were engaged in a rather genteel game of strategic embroidery. Anne Boleyn, the queen who dared to say no. Our next royal figure, Anne Boleyn, wasn't born to be a queen. She was born to be noticed. Intelligent, fashionable, and possessing a sharp wit that could cut through the dense fog of courtly platitudes, Anne knew how to command attention in a room full of powdered men who mistakenly believed their knowledge of Latin made them irresistible. She arrived at the English court in the early 1500s, like a stylish and intellectual storm. While not conventionally beautiful by the standards of the time, she possessed a magnetic allure, a sense of self-assurance that hinted, "I'm smarter than you, and I'm fully aware of it." King Henry VIII, a monarch not known for his restraint when his desires were piqued, took one look at Anne and promptly seemed to forget that he already had a wife, Catherine of Aragon. Unfortunately for Catherine, Anne wasn't interested in the fleeting status of a king's mistress. Her ambitions were set considerably higher, somewhere around the level of a crown. Henry pursued her for years, showering her with love letters that oscillated between passionate declarations and the whiny pronouncements of a petulant teenager. He ultimately tore the very fabric of English society apart, just to marry her, creating the Church of England so he could annul his existing marriage and place a ring on Anne's undeniably ambitious finger. This wasn't romance. It was a state-sponsored act of royal obsession. Once she became queen, Anne Boleyn was not content to simply sit quietly and produce male heirs. She was opinionated, sharp-tongued, and openly disliked by a significant portion of the court, largely because she dared to express her views and didn't swoon at insincere flattery. She also had a habit of playfully teasing Henry in public, a move that, while likely amusing to onlookers, was undeniably bold considering his track record with previous wives. Then came the inevitable problem. No son, only a daughter, Elizabeth, who would later become one of England's most formidable rulers, but at the time was a major disappointment to a king fixated on securing a male successor. Suddenly, Anne's quick wit and fashionable charm seemed less appealing to Henry. Rumors began to circulate, affairs with courtiers, incest with her own brother, witchcraft, adultery. Most of these accusations were patently absurd, even by the standards of the Tudor court. But Henry was growing restless and looking for an exit strategy, preferably one that involved a blade. Anne was arrested, subjected to a sham trial that would have made a kangaroo court blush, and ultimately executed by a French swordsman who was specifically imported for the occasion. Because if you're going to execute your queen, you might as well do it with a touch of continental flair. Anne Boleyn lost her head, but she did not lose her place in history. She remains the queen who played the long game, won the throne against seemingly insurmountable odds, and then lost everything because she dared to say no before she ultimately said yes. Her story is a potent reminder of the precarious nature of power and the often deadly consequences of challenging a volatile and absolute monarch. Christina of Denmark, the witty widow who dodged a royal beheading. Some queens rise to power through scandal, others through strategic seduction. And then there's Christina of Denmark, whose ascent to historical notoriety came through a combination of sharp wit, diplomatic finesse, and a remarkable talent for delivering a verbal slapdown without ever smudging her lipstick. Born into Danish royalty in 1521, Christina was married off at a young age, a standard practice in the 16th century where teenage girls essentially served as walking diplomatic treaties adorned in velvet gowns. Her husband, the Duke of Milan, died shortly after their marriage, leaving Christina a widow at the tender age of 16. For a noblewoman of the time, this wasn't necessarily a tragedy. It often meant newfound wealth, independence, and the blissful absence of someone trying to explain complex tax policies over dinner. Enter Henry VIII, recently single in a rather dramatic fashion, notoriously impatient, and already having gone through 2 wives, one divorced, one beheaded. Anne Boleyn's execution was still, so to speak, cooling off. Naturally, Henry, ever the optimist in matters of matrimony, dispatched the renowned portrait painter Hans Holbein the Younger to capture Christina's likeness and assess her suitability as his next bride. Christina, a woman who is clearly both politically astute and not particularly keen on becoming wife number 3, or more accurately, target number 3, took one look at the proposal and famously replied, "If I had 2 heads, I would happily put one at the disposal of the King of England." This wasn't just a polite refusal. It was a burn so savage it deserves to be etched in marble for eternity. Henry, predictably, was reportedly not amused. He continued to pursue her for a while, because nothing says romance quite like completely ignoring a cutting diplomatic insult and pressing forward with marriage negotiations anyway. Christina, however, remained steadfastly unenthusiastic, possibly because she quite enjoyed the sensation of having her head firmly attached to her shoulders. Instead of becoming the Queen of England and potentially execution number 3, Christina wisely chose a much safer path, marrying a duke who wasn't known for beheading his spouses over breakfast. She lived comfortably, ruled her territories with intelligence, and crucially, kept her neck intact for the rest of her life, a significant achievement in the perilous world of 16th century European royalty. Later in life, Christina served as a regent for her nephew, demonstrated a surprising aptitude for military strategy, and continued to collect portraits, presumably of men who didn't have a history of marital homicide. Christina of Denmark never sat on the English throne, but her legendary quote has ensured her a lasting place in history. She is proof that sometimes the most powerful move a woman can make isn't accepting a crown, but gracefully, and with a perfectly delivered zinger, dodging it entirely. Maria of Portugal, a mother's love and a son's grisly revenge. Maria of Portugal began her royal journey in a manner typical of many noble women of her era. Reluctantly married to a man twice her age, expected to offer polite smiles, and ideally produce an heir without posing too many inconvenient questions. She married Alfonso XI of Castile, a king known for his battlefield victories, an ego the size of Toledo, and a mistress he openly favored. This wasn't a clandestine affair conducted behind closed doors. Alfonso flaunted his relationship with Leonor de Guzman like a prized trophy, complete with better backstory and superior housing benefits. Maria, understandably, was less than thrilled with this arrangement. She did, however, fulfill her primary duty by providing Alfonso with a legitimate heir, the future Peter the Cruel. Meanwhile, Leonor gifted Alfonso with 10 illegitimate children and seemed to garner the lion's share of royal affection, perks, and palace real estate. After Alfonso's death, Maria finally found herself in a position of some influence. She returned to Portugal with her teenage son, Peter, and proceeded to do what any understandably embittered and sidelined queen might do. She clung to her son with an almost obsessive intensity, viewing him as both her emotional anchor and a potential instrument of revenge. Historians often politely describe her relationship with Peter as overprotective. Less charitable accounts raise eyebrows and point to the undeniably strange intensity of their bond. When Peter grew older, he fell deeply in love with his longtime mistress, Inés de Castro, and eventually married her. Maria did not approve. Some suggest her disapproval stemmed from Inés's lower noble status. Others speculate that Maria simply didn't want to share Peter's affections with any woman who wasn't herself. Regardless of her motivations, things escalated rapidly and tragically. According to one particularly dramatic version of events, Maria actively encouraged and possibly orchestrated Inés's assassination. Peter, upon learning of his beloved's brutal murder, responded in a manner befitting his future moniker, the Cruel. He reportedly had Inés's body exhumed, declared her his rightful queen, placed her decaying corpse on the throne, and forced the terrified nobles of his court to kiss her rotting hand. A completely measured and rational royal response, wouldn't you agree? Did Maria truly mastermind Inés's killing? The historical evidence remains inconclusive, but her name certainly lingered in the hushed whispers behind the palace curtains for years to come. Later in life, Maria withdrew from the political arena and may have even begun referring to herself as Empress in private. While there's no definitive proof of outright madness, she certainly spent a considerable amount of time staring out windows and penning letters that no one ever read. Maria of Portugal never achieved the romantic fulfillment she may have desired, but she did secure a lifetime of palace intrigue, scandalous gossip, and the dubious distinction of being remembered as the mother-in-law from medieval hell. Olga of Kiev, vengeance served cold, and with pigeons. Our next figure, Olga of Kiev, was not a woman to be trifled with. When her husband, Prince Igor, was brutally murdered by the neighboring Drevlian tribe in 945, they made a critical error in judgment. They assumed his widow would simply grieve quietly, and then, as an added insult, accept a marriage proposal from the Drevlian prince. They clearly underestimated the resolve of a woman whose husband had just been tied to trees and ripped in half. Olga, however, played her hand with a chilling calmness.